Nigel Farage called this by-election. It didn't have to happen at all. He's not going there. He wasn't there for the returning officer to announce his win. We'll talk about why in a moment, but how do you feel about his win, increasing the vote by 1,000?
Resounding victory. I think the people of Clacton have spoken. I think yesterday was a scorcher, yet they came out in their thousands. Turnout is almost 45%. I think it's 44.3%.
It was 58.7% in the last election, but of course that's different. It's not a by-election.
My point being is, if I was sitting here this morning and turnout was at 20%, you'd be saying something very different, right? This is a people's movement, and I think it's important that this is recognised. This is the people sending a message to the establishment that they want change, they want reform, they want Nigel to lead the country.
9,455 people wanted Count Binface.
Yeah, and he got, by the way, he got, I think, £180,000 from Dale Vince, who's a big Labour supporter. He got activists from the Conservative Party and from Labour going out to try and knock on doors for him.
Well, obviously worked.
No, it didn't. I tell you why. No, I tell you why it didn't. Because the main party should have stood their candidates. It is absolutely disgraceful that they haven't. Because elections matter. Because we're a democracy.
This was completely unnecessary.
Rubbish.
It was completely unnecessary. When he stood there and gave this speech about this will be me against the establishment.
It is.
How can you be against the establishment? This is a. This is the privately educated former city trader who was also an MEP. He is the very embodiment of the establishment.
No, he's not.
And he's against people like Count Binface, 3 monster raving loony candidates. That's hardly the establishment that's up against them. I mean,
that's because Labour, the Conservatives, the Lib Dems were for it. They were frightened. If they thought they had half a chance in Clacton, they would have put up candidates. You know that.
Why would they do this? This was a disgrace that he did
this.
It is a
democracy.
He has made himself look ridiculous, but more than that, this is a disgrace with the way he's treated the people of Clacton.
Well, the people of Clacton have spoken.
Well,
and if you have tin ears, and if the establishment politicians have tin ears to this, then they will see what will happen in the general election.
To pretend that he is somehow against the establishment in this election is just. I think anyone who looks at the candidates, the 34 candidates.
Okay, look. Well, the people of Clacton, you might say, Nadeem, have spoken, but who we haven't heard speak directly at the point of his win is Nigel Farage. So this all emerged in the few hours before the returning officer, just after 6, said who'd won. So he gave a speech, not at the count, where you traditionally find people, particularly people who look likely to win, to be. It was at a separate, just outside Clacton, sort of party gathering of the Reform Party. And he said in his speech, I'm sad to say, after 33 years of being a candidate, I've been advised tonight that there is an organised campaign to disrupt and degrade the result. I think we can hear a little bit from him, can't we?
And I'm sad to say that after 33 years of being a candidate in active politics, I've been advised tonight by Essex Police that there is an organised campaign to disrupt and degrade the result that will take place in a few hours' time.
But then, after disrupt and degrade, we'll ask you what you understand that might mean. But then afterwards, in a statement after Farage's speech, we understand that a Reform UK spokesman said it was more than humiliation, that Essex Police had advised Nigel not to attend the count due to a credible threat against him. But we understand that Essex Police hadn't advised any of the candidates not to attend. What's going on?
You heard Nigel. We had Anne Widdecombe's funeral yesterday. Disrupt and degrade would have been a humiliation for our great democracy that your forefathers and your viewers' forefathers fought for. And I think giving them that pleasure would be wrong. And I think Nigel's right to step away from it.
Being a credible threat. Credible threat is a very sort of a police term, isn't it? It's something that we use when there is something serious about to happen. Humiliation, I'm afraid, is part and parcel, as you know, of the cut and thrust of a democracy. Actually, people can protest and they can heckle.
I don't disagree with you. And you know, the Prime Minister Andy Burnham, his by-election, walked off the stage very, very quickly.
But he turned up. He was there on stage.
And if somebody wants to disrupt and degrade our democracy, I don't think we should give them...
I think it's...
We should give them that platform. And I think Nigel's right. He spoke to the people of Clacton. He thanked all his volunteers, and he spoke to the nation last night. And that's the right thing to do. But look, we would be watching images this morning of humiliation, disruption, degradation.
Why would you want that? Just to be very clear on the record, because this is breaking news this morning. Obviously, we've just had the result. Can you are, I know you're here as our panellist, but you are obviously Reform UK today also. Can you clarify whether your spokesman was right or wrong when they told a reporter at the Clacton by-election count that the police had said that there was a credible threat?
So what Nigel said, and what I will say to you today, is he was told that there would be an organised disruption and an ability to degrade the count, and he chose, quite rightly in my view, to speak to the country, to speak to the people of Clacton directly and explain his position.
Okay, but that's the right thing. Look,
there are credible threats to Nigel almost daily.
Yes, but sorry, this is very important because you raised the very, the distressing situation of Anne Widdecombe's death. Yeah. Right. So you've said that it was her funeral. This is, it's shocked the nation.
Of course it did.
But I do think it's really important. Language is so important.
Absolutely.
And I don't think there should be a merging in between something that is humiliating and a protest and something that the police might have told you is a credible threat. I think there's a huge chasm between the two ideas of what that means.
So I think, take Nigel's words, what he wasn't going to allow to happen is a disruption and degradation of our democratic process.
What did he believe was going to happen? What did he know?
In politics, he's never missed a count. Missing it early hours this morning because people were going to organise themselves to disrupt it was the right decision.
But hang on 1 second. So the last person who didn't turn up to winning it was Bobby Sands, who you'll remember, most of our viewers won't. 1981, he was in prison and on hunger strike, member of, the...
IRA.
Actually, I think maybe he would say he wasn't at that point, but, certainly deeply associated with the IRA. Right. So we're talking about a big action that comes from a big political statement. Him not going there because, he understood there was a credible threat, as your spokesman, the spokesman of Reform UK, told reporters at the count, is one thing. Him not going because it might be humiliating and people might poke fun at him is a very different thing, as Ranvis says, in the climate of Anne Widdecombe's death.
Well, first of all, Nigel's not frightened of taking those people on. He took them on through the campaign every single day.
I think do you not know either what's happening?
No,
I think that's what...
the big difference is...
I think we're trying to get clarity on whether somebody has said that the police told Nigel Farage there was a credible threat and that was wrong, or whether there was a credible threat. And it's about the representation of reform of what Nigel was saying and whether people can get their facts right, actually.
I don't disagree with you, but you just played a clip of Nigel.
Yes.
Take Nigel through his own words.
Yes.
He's saying that
so the reform spokesman was wrong, there wasn't a credible threat.
Those people who he was told were going to organise to disrupt and degrade the count. That is actually a very sensible thing to do.
Nigel Farage knows that this was a mistake to call this by-election. I'm sure by now he's hopefully realised that. It was a disgrace that he actually went through this charade of calling this by-election when he completely didn't have to. And now he's just showing contempt for the people of Clacton. But, I think he probably genuinely didn't want to turn up there and get humiliated, because that's what would have happened.
He's been on the doorstep every single day. Did you see the images last night of the people turning up?
He was being humiliated on the doorsteps.
He's on the... No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, the messaging from the uni parties is that this didn't need to happen. Yes, it did need to happen.
Explain what you mean by uni party. I think that's a very political language, and I don't think viewers know what that means.
So the establishment parties, the Labour and the Conservatives
and the Lib Dems,
who were all
with people like you in it, who are obviously part of the establishment.
No, hold on a second.
I find this astonishing that you have so many people in your party who
if the Labour Party thought they could win Clacton,
who have come from the Conservative Party, who have got, you know, very much enmeshed in the establishment, and you can still turn around and say, in some magical world that you live in, that reform is not part of the establishment. It's like
reform is not part of the establishment. Absolutely right. That's why I've joined reform. That's why at my press conference with Nigel, I apologised for all the mistakes we made as a government, because reform is the only serious party that will change the country for the better. People's taxes have gone up, energy bills have gone up.
You call an unnecessary by-election.
So the by-election has happened. The result has come in. He's won.
Yes.
He's got his seat back.
Yes.
Literally, we're back to square one. Nothing has really changed.
Yeah.
Apart from the fact the parliamentary standards.
A lot has changed.
Well, what has changed?
I tell you
the
what's
parliamentary
changed.
standards investigation into his finances will resume, will it not? And now that result still has to come in. And if that finds against him, there may well have to be another by-election in Clacton.
So, first of all, the kangaroo court made up of our opponents wasn't going to have their say. Nigel wanted to take his message.
You mean the Parliamentary Standards Committee? Of
our opponents, the committee that is effectively made up of Labour and Conservative and other MPs.
So what you're saying that was a bias, those two committees, because it's two separate investigations, isn't it? So you're saying that both of those were actively seeking to, you know, humiliate, imply negative things about Nigel Farage. The problem is they're going to still go on.
Yes.
So what's it achieved?
And I tell you what it has achieved, because I think the message to the establishment is you can't do this. This is a people's movement.
But they are
and Nigel
because
will
it's the
prevail.
law.
Why? Because you can't be judge, jury and executioner, right, to somebody who clearly frightens the establishment. Clearly, Nigel worries, whether it's the mainstream media or the mandarins in Whitehall, that change is coming, right? And they tried to take him down. They couldn't. He's now back as an MP, and you watch what will happen in the country. The people of Clacton are effectively representing what the rest of the country feels. We're going to talk about all sorts of subjects today where the establishment has failed the people. The
question we're asking is, you know, that he's done all of this. It's cost the taxpayers, by the way, £250,000. But he's done all of this, got himself elected with 1,000 more votes than the last time. The thing that triggered his desire to do this was his horror at the investigation of the two parliamentary...
No, what triggered it was a stitch-up.
Well, you say stitch-up, yes. They say investigation, OK? But we're back to the square one. We are literally back to square one with those two investigations going ahead. So how can you think anything's been achieved?
When Nigel Farage made his speech where he said this was going to be him against the establishment, I'll tell you what it made me think of, and I'm old enough to remember this, was the Jonathan Aitken speech of the Sword of Truth. And anyone who's watching who remembers Jonathan Aitken will know that didn't end very well for him. And I think it's just another example of hubris. Someone who thinks, I'm above the law, I can do what I like. I mean, on the £5 million donation, I mean, he's changed his name.
You see,
the £5 million
it's not a donation.
Given.
It is not a donation. And you deliberately misled the audience just now.
The £5 million he was given by this
an unconditional gift.
Can I speak for a minute? I'm sorry. The £5 million he's been given by this crypto millionaire, he's changed his mind so many times on what that was for. I mean, he has. He said it was
given. You've just misled. I hope you will correct the record this morning.
He's been given it to help with his
will you correct
security.
The record?
Oh, I'm happy to say it wasn't. If it's not a donation, I'm not quite sure what it was.
Say it's a gift.
A gift to Nigel Farage.
See,
there you go.
So you're just proving my point.
Can I ask a question, actually? It's an interesting one you raise. Yeah. If this £5 million is for security, why didn't he use some of it to provide security to come to the Count and stand on the stage? Because that's what it's for, isn't it?
The amount of money that is being spent on Nigel's security at the moment, and has been for many, many years, because he has been the change
candidate. But he could clearly
candidate.
afford his security to get to the Count overnight, because he's been given £5 million for that very job.
Yes,
according to him. So why didn't he use some of it to turn up at the Count?
What we weren't going to do was give a platform to those who want to disrupt and degrade our democracy. Why would you want to do that?
So much for free speech, then?
No, well, put up candidates. Why didn't Labour put up a candidate? Why didn't the Conservatives put up a candidate?
Because
they were frightened.
By-election,
no, it's not, because they were frightened.
There was no need for
now
it.
They say, Labour and Kemi Baden and others say they will put up candidates if there's a second by-election. That is, forgive me, but that is a presumption of what will happen to this kangaroo court.
Can I just ask, Christina, look, and both of you, obviously, when you look at the poll since Andy Burnham has come in, there's been a bounce for Labour, which I suppose is natural in lots of ways. When there's a new bit of energy, generally people go, let's give them a chance. And I suppose, you know, polling, and I suppose you set up YouGov, didn't you, many years ago, so you know all about polling, Nadine Zahawi. But, and you believe in polls because you made your money from them, so I'm going to... Right, so
hold you to account.
Right, so you can't be one of those people who then...
No,
you know,
I'm not.
Criticises
exactly
the polls,
right. And the most important poll
is a general election, right? Okay.
Right?
So,
and what happened last night? The people of Clacton spoke, and it was resounding.
But,
this is what people can't get over this morning, right?
Yeah, but can I ask you this question about
It would have been wonderful for Labour and the Conservatives to wake up where there's been a low turnout. They would say, you see, we told you so.
Let me
it's a massive turnout for a by-election.
To both of you, a thought on this. The mood music from pollsters, and indeed the results of those polls, seems to be the feeling generally that in recent times Nigel Farage's judgment has been a bit off. One of the things that he has been very good at is testing the air and then going that way, and you know he does that very, very well. He's a great orator, and he clearly taps into something in the British public or in a certain section of it. There is a certain feeling, and the polls are starting to show this, that there's a slight waning of the peak of Nigel Farage's impact, interest, vigour, and the fact that people believe in him the way they used to. So what do you think of that? Because that seems to be the way things are going, that he's lost his peak.
I think you can only fool people. You know, you can't fool all the people all of the time. And I think some of this is now happening. This is coming back to bite Nigel Farage in a way, and that, you know, he makes all these claims that aren't really backed up by any evidence. Not all the time. I'm not saying he never says anything backed up by evidence, but a lot of the time he just makes outrageous claims. You know, he tries to present himself as something that he clearly isn't. This kind of man of the people, anti-establishment figure. You know, from the kind of background I have, he's very much part of the establishment. And I think what you're seeing now with the Andy Burnham bounce, as it were, is that he is someone who actually is a man of the people. He is someone who has that kind of background that connects with ordinary people in this country.
Right.
You saw the results, literally, an hour ago? That poll of the people of Clacton
is the one you believe.
It's the real world.
So let's bring you more on that breaking news. A petition to stop PC Harper's killers being released early from prison has now reached 1 million signatures. The chair of the Labour Party, Bridget Phillipson, joins us now. Good morning to you. You've had many, many weeks of moving the goalposts on what will happen to PC Harper's killers. Obviously an enormous strength of feeling from the country, and that is now down to 1 million people who have gone so far as to take the effort to click that button and sign the petition. What is the government's position this morning?
Hello, good morning. The position of the government, as Andy Burnham has set out, is that we want to find a solution to make sure those individuals are not released early from prison. I do appreciate the awful circumstances surrounding the murder of PC Harper. I know that this must be an incredibly difficult time for his family, especially coming up to that anniversary. And, you know, this demonstrates the importance of making sure we've got the right number of prison places so we never again end up in a situation where we're having to consider what are clearly, you know, very, very difficult considerations that we don't want to be in a position to be having to think about, because we should be in a country where we're not facing these pressures on our prison system. And the reality of where we got to was that unless we took steps around early release of some prisoners, we could end up in a situation where violent people were being arrested and we had nowhere to put them because we'd simply run out of places, and that's not acceptable, and we're doing everything we can to turn that around.
We spoke to PC Harper's mum, Debbie. We have several times on the programme, as I'm sure you know. And when it's put to her that we don't want the criminal justice system and the prison system to collapse, she says, that's not my problem. That's the government's problem. What I want and what all victims want is to see justice. And what she has found very challenging and emotionally flooring has been the different messages that come through from the government. So the pausing initially and saying we're going to look at this, and then the news from the Ministry of Justice that actually the two that were likely to be released were going to be released and nothing could stop that, and then coming back and saying that that might change. And every time we've discussed this subject, that petition has put hundreds of thousands more on. I think the feeling is that unless there's some proper decisions made, it's going to start to look like the government cannot handle a huge challenge.
Look, I cannot begin to imagine what the family are going through at the moment. I cannot begin to imagine the trauma they've experienced over many years, and I appreciate how having to talk about it all again in the context of where we are makes it even harder. And that's true of all victims who are, you know, in this awful situation that we do not want to be in, but we are, and we are committed to finding a solution. And Andy Burnham has been clear that we will do that, and that in September the Justice Secretary will set out a plan to Parliament to make sure that we respond to this, that we keep the public safe, and we do make sure that when we're arresting new violent offenders, we don't end up being unable to detain them because we don't have the places in our prisons. We are building more prison places. The last government failed to do that, and we will. But I'm not for 1 second going to seek to minimise the pain or the trauma that families are experiencing, and I completely understand the strength of feeling about those involved in the murder of PC Harper.
Bridget Phillipson, can we talk about the Clacton by-election now? Of course, that was the breaking news this morning at 6 o'clock when the declaration was made. Nigel Farage chose not to go to that count to give a victory speech, and we've been discussing his reasons why, and Essex Police is looking at, you know, what they thought the safety concerns may or may not have been. But in terms of the political result, anyway, he did what he set out to do in the first place, which is to prove to you and to the nation that he is ever more popular in Clacton, and that, as he says, the public have spoken.
Well, the voters in Clacton have made their decision, but the reason that Nigel Farage called this by-election in the first place was to distract from the growing scandal and the many, many questions that he simply refuses to answer, whether that's about that £5 million dodgy gift or his connections to a convicted fraudster, all of the sleaze and the scandal that just keeps piling up. And now the by-election is out of the way, I look forward to Nigel Farage levelling with the British public, setting out all of the detail around this and not continuing to refuse to answer reasonable questions about exactly what's gone on there. Reasonable questions that journalists have asked, not just other politicians from other political parties. And he's made himself a national laughingstock. I mean, this has just been an absurd spectacle. But there are serious issues here, and those serious issues now need some answers.
Yeah, but the thing is, of course, is that you know as well as we do that when a parliamentary standards investigator comes back with a decision, and let's say it is something that suggests that Nigel Farage did breach the code, we don't know that, of course, that could trigger a second by-election. But we already have heard from the party this morning that they don't even believe in the independence and rigour of that standards committee, because they say it's stacked up with Labour and Conservative MPs and it's stacked against them anyway.
Look, we have strong processes in Parliament to make sure that all of us who are MPs are held to the highest possible standard, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on what might or might not happen through that process. It's, you know, it's independent for a reason.
Can you talk to the rigour and independence of that particular investigation? Because I think the Reform Party, we've heard it this morning, are already saying, look, we don't even give credit to the investigating committee because we feel that we're already, you know, hung, drawn and quartered, if you like.
Look, this is a proper process that is rigorous and is done to the highest standards. And I think those of us who are members of Parliament need to show respect to that process, understand that it's there for a reason, and it's there to make sure that we are held to account for our actions and that we are held to the highest standards in public life. That is our responsibility. No matter which political party you're in, that process is there for a reason. And sadly, what we see time and again from reformed politicians is that they just think the rules don't apply to them, that somehow they don't have to answer questions, or they don't have to answer questions that journalists put to them. In fact, we've seen a concerted attempt in recent weeks actually to shut down scrutiny, to challenge journalists who ask reasonable questions as to exactly what has gone on. And I don't think that bodes well for our democracy. We do depend on having a system where people are prepared to answer difficult questions, even if they don't like them. And Nigel Farage, you know, the questions grow by the day, but he just, whenever the going gets tough, he hides, and there's no hiding place now.
Well, that was the breaking news overnight, but of course the weather and all its many implications has been a story dominating all our lives for a long time. One of those is the fact that large parts of England are now in a drought situation with hosepipe bans, and yet we hear this morning 24 million people are going to have to pay more for their water bills. In terms of Southern Water, it's £45 or just under that more. How can people feel they're paying more when there's been patently so little investment on many levels in our water system? Andy Burnham said it's wrong that the bill payers should fund and have to deal with the consequences of that lack of investment. What's he actually going to do about it?
Look, it is hard to justify. You know, we've seen consistent failure over many years in the water industry, and the last thing that people need at this time is to be facing an increase in their bills. I mean, there is variation across the country, but I think what we've seen...
Yes, there is variation, but he has talked about taking control and nationalising it. He talked about before the Makerfield by-election, he talked about it before he became leader and then Prime Minister. He's now in a position to do that.
Yeah, and as I say, we have had consistent failure over many years. It's why we have taken steps, for example, to take action on the bonuses that water executives are facing, including where they've been engaged, where their companies have, been engaged in some terrible practices around kind of sewage and much more besides. But there is more to do, and Andy Burnham has been completely upfront about that. These are not easy propositions. This is not easy to unravel kind of what we've seen in terms of decades of failure. But we will do more, and Andy Burnham will be setting up more detail on that.
So we'll have to pay in the meantime?
Look, we can't magically fix a system that has developed and kind of failed for so long. But what we can do is make sure that those responsible for running water companies are held to account, and we've passed legislation to make sure that that happens.
Was the water regulator Ofwat wrong, you think, to allow 5 of these water suppliers to be able to increase their bills for us?
Look, and I can understand how frustrated kind of customers in those areas will be about, rising prices at a time where there are big challenges and where there's been real failure in the industry. I mean, there are differences between water companies. That's not to make excuses, but there is variation in terms of their performance across the country.
Has the watchdog
to do it in those areas then?
Has the watchdog let us down?
Look, I think we have also been looking at the role for the watchdog to make sure that they have the powers that they need, but also take the necessary action to protect consumers, to make sure that that investment does go in. Because, you started off quite rightly by talking about the weather that we're experiencing at the moment, the drought, the hosepipe bans and so forth. Again, we haven't built a reservoir in a country in decades, in this country in decades, and that's part of that long-term failure that we need to get to grips with.
Why give the companies that have led to that situation, why allow Ofwat? Do you think they were right or wrong? I know they're independent. Look, it's charge more for something that the service is failing.
Look, it's hard to justify. It is hard to justify, and that's why we've got to take a proper look at all of this, whether it's the role of the regulator, the way that the system is designed, the nature of how the kind of water industry operates in our country, and that's exactly what Andy Burnham intends to do.
All right, Bridget Phillipson, thank you so much for joining us on Good Morning Britain this morning. We're joined now, listening to all of that, was the former General Secretary of Unison, Christina McNee, and the former Conservative Chancellor, now the Reform UK supporter, Nadeem Zahawi. Let's just pick up on, where should we begin? Should we begin
Should we talk about water?
Yeah, let's talk about water. We're there. Yeah, what do you think? I mean, Ofwat have been given permission to all these water firms to charge customers 36% more. Are they wrong?
I think they're probably wrong, yeah. We've got a water industry in this country that has been allowed for many years to just go into debt, to pay huge sums of money to their shareholders more than they were making in profits, therefore just adding to the debt, and that happened under the Conservatives. And what I'd like the government to do is actually to renationalise the water industry. I mean,
Andy Burnham said that. That's why I think,
and I'd like to see it happen.
Well, you'd like to see it happen, but I wonder why, if that's what he said he wanted to do, it's now not doing anything about it, because it feels for many people like insult to industry. They can't water their gardens, they can't have their paddling pools out, and yet they're expected to pay more.
Yeah, I mean, it's outrageous what they've been allowed to get away with, and this just adds insult to injury, that people are now having to pay for the infrastructure reforms that should have been dealt with for many years when these companies were making vast profits. Of course, now what you have is a situation where they're hugely in debt. I mean, I live in London. Thames Water's, £20 billion in debt? I mean, personally, I think the government should start with Thames Water, bring it back under national control, government control, and I honestly think they shouldn't give money back to the investors, because they've already made huge amounts of money out of this company, and nothing has been done in terms of investing in infrastructure. And that's probably why I'm assuming that that's what Ofwat are saying. This is the only way to get investment into the infrastructure, is to take this money and actually try and fix the system.
James, are we 1 billion litres a day leaked from pipes across the country? We're an island surrounded by water. It does baffle most reasonable people as to how companies can be paying their shareholders, their CEOs, getting nice bonuses, and then probably going off in yachts and going off across, you know, the Mediterranean to enjoy the water, whilst we're all struggling here in the heat, in droughts. Has Ofwat dropped the ball here, do you think, for the public?
It's definitely a failure of regulation. Look, we haven't built a reservoir since 1992. And reservoirs are nice. You know, people, you can't sort of make the same argument in terms of the, you know, people might feel that not having something next to their home.
There is a lot of planning resistance to them, though, but I agree, I don't understand it, because they're lovely places to spend your time.
It is a failure of regulation. It's a failure of governance. Now, look, there is going to be leakage. You know, under even the Soviet Union, there was massive leakage when it was all state-controlled. The problem is, why should the taxpayer end up footing the bill? If you take Thames Water alone, that's 4 billion straight away, then another 20 billion. If you take the whole water industry, you're talking about hundreds of billions. Why should the taxpayer bear that?
What would reform do?
Well, I would say the regulator is to be challenged. Why are we allowing these water companies not to build the infrastructure? Israel, which has a hotter climate than the UK. The United Arab Emirates has a warmer climate than the UK, has a much better water strategy than we have. You know, it's insane that we've allowed this failure of regulation, and under reform, that will change.
But would you? Well, and you say
but
it will change.
You can't nationalise it and make the taxpayer
foot the burden. Change it?
Well, the investors, because the investors who've taken their dividend, right? They're the ones that need to basically now effectively pay up for it.
I know you're reform now, but the Conservatives were in power for 14 years and didn't build any reservoirs.
It's a big failure of regulation. So much of what we're listening to Bridget Phillips.
I just want to hear what Christina was going to say. Go on,
If you just leave it as it currently is and say, let's just give it back to the companies, let's bring in some new regulations that say they have to spend some of their money, they'll find lots of excuses not to do it. For me, water is such a fundamental, you know, it's necessary to everybody's life.
Yes.
It's necessary for everything we want to do in this country. It was always wrong, in my opinion, to privatise it, to let it become something that could be would be for profit. And we saw the consequences of that, where, as I said, companies were giving out more in dividends than they were actually making in profits. And therefore, they were just consistently building up debt. And I think if you leave it to the companies again, there is a huge risk that can happen
again. There is an enormous cost in renationalising it as well. There is an implication.
So it doesn't have to be.
OK.
So there doesn't have to be. Apparently, there are ways that you can bring it in.
How?
Well, I haven't got the full details, but I understand there are lawyers, top lawyers looking at this at the moment.
We can't find £14 billion for defence. How are you going to find £200 billion off the taxpayer?
You don't pay them that kind of money. They've already made huge amounts of money.
It's not them.
Thames Water
You're asking the taxpayer to pick up the bill.
No, I'm not. Thames Water has breached every contract, every bit of its contract. Therefore, why should they get money?
It's a failure of regulation. That's the point.
If we take it back into
it's a failure of regulation.
I'm afraid that it's not going to go away. It's only going to get hotter.